Welcome to the Fourth of Whiteboard Wednesday. Had good feedback from our last Whiteboard Wednesday, and in fact received probably a dozen or so list matrices from a number of Melbourne supporters, and I reckon people are pretty well on the mark. And what it did show was that we're obviously a very young list, and we've got a lot of work to do. Pleasingly, after the weekend, I think most Melbourne supporters would have seen more of the positive signs as in the younger players coming through the system, and some hopefully growing maturity and growing belief, and from our perspective a standard's been set, and that's our expectation that we play to that standard and better from this point onwards. But one of the things which happened over the weekend was that I did the media roadshow, particularly on radio, where I did 3 radio interviews, and there's a certain themes and consistency which comes with the line of questioning, and perhaps the most obvious question is one of measurement of performance. And whilst it might be asked in a whole lot of different ways, there's always this infatuation with how many wins a certain club's going to have, or how many members it's going to have. It's almost, we revert back to these very obvious measurements of when we're talking about performance. And for a developing club, or a very old club but still very much in a development phase, and a developing football team, how you establish measurements of performance is one of the great challenges, and probably is for any business. So I think there'll be some interest in this particular Whiteboard Wednesday, not only from the perspective of Melbourne supporters wanting to know where the club's at, where the team's at, but also in regard to people who just face the day-to-day challenges of measuring performance. So what we're going to talk about today is that, and particularly in an organisation. Here's a couple of good books. I like to throw in a book. This one's called Sacred Hoops, which is Phil Jackson's journey with the Chicago Bulls at a time when he was trying to bring together these amazing personalities and obviously great athletes. And the interesting thing in going through this terrific book of one of the great coaches is how they ever kept track of where they were at and the performance aspects of it all. And so the one thing which is and this book's very much about the spirituality of sport, which I'm also a great believer in as well. But how do you establish measurements in that sort of environment? And also the one thing, obviously a lot of focus in the last few weeks on Dean Bailey and as the coach of the club. And there's another terrific book. It's called The Second Most Important Job in the Country. And I asked the question before. I said, well, were people more interested in who coaches their AFL club or who's the Prime Minister of the country? And this book really focuses on that. How important the manager or the coach is to the individual, the people who love our club and support our club. As I said, this talks on measuring performance. The first, the model that I'm utilising or using is again out of the strategic update. It's a very similar looking model to what we originally put together with the profit model of previous Whiteboard Wednesday, and that's quite deliberate. And I'll work through those frameworks as we go. The first one is, rather than looking at, as in the profit model, we looked at the whole of the opportunities, basically the basis of which we start this thing with in a big circle, which is simply the competition. It's what's happening in the AFL. It's what's happening in the clubs. So the clubs are a critical component of this, and it's basically trying to establish and always have an understanding of where the competition's going, various trends in the game, what various clubs are doing. For instance, our competition is going to go through the most massive change that it's gone through in a number of decades with the introduction of 2 new AFL clubs. And with that, new rules, we've got we've got free agency coming into the system. So there's a lot of things always happening. It's a very dynamic environment. And part of our obvious challenge is always understanding where the game's heading and how we can actually grab a competitive advantage when you think, in the end, our absolute objective is this notion of winning football. And as we know, games are very, very hard to win. One team wins, one team loses every single weekend. So that's one of the challenges. So in trying to establish measurement, what we look at is a couple of frameworks. You've got to be able to measure, obviously, team performance, but team performance is quite obviously also a factor of individual performance as well. And so we come up with 4 means by which we look at the individual players and try and measure their performance. And the critical thing that we actually try to do, again, this is where judgment comes into it, and it comes back to that list matrix of last week, is that we say, okay, where is the player at now in regard to these dimensions, and where with personal development and training and development can we actually take him to? And there's 4 dimensions that we look at here. The first one, simply this, is football skills. And the football skills are simply, the capacity to do the pure aspects of the game. How well they handle the ball, how well they kick the ball, how well they make judgments, all those sorts of things. It's the pure aspects of football skills. Almost the God-given and developed aspects of that individual. The next thing that we actually then look at is the person's physical skills, which is quite clearly things like their athletic ability, and both football skills and physical skills need to relate to the likely role the person's going to play in AFL football. So for instance, the physical skills of a full forward are different expectations than the physical skills of a ruckman or a midfielder in that sense. So it's got to be applicable to AFL football and their role. And again, we measure these not just in the context of our team, but their capacity to impact on the competition. The next one is the personal skills of the individual. And there's more and more pressure on AFL football in regard to this. Not just in the context of the behavioural aspects of it, because that gets a lot of focus now, as we well know, but also just how well organised a person is, what leadership qualities they bring to the group, and all those types of things. The obvious things that you can say when and I think we've got a young bloke, for instance, James McDonald, who just really steps up in regard to these. He's one of the best young guys I've come across in footy. And the final one is their capacity to put all this together into a game-related situation, so it's simply game skills. And so in the game skills, we have had players in the past, and we've still got players on our list who feature very, very strongly in these areas, but have, at this stage, an inability to really translate that into a match situation. And so that can sometimes be an intuitive thing. Can they make decisions under pressure? We might have a guy who does goal kicking on a training night, gets 100%, goes into a game situation and only has the ability to get 30-40%. So it's their capacity to translate all of these things into a game situation to create value. And once again, these things are all very much related. They're not mutually exclusive, and we should never think in that way.